Good morning, students, and welcome back to Political Sociology. And we're in week 7, and the lecture will be much shorter this week because I think that the readings, to a large extent, speak for themselves. And they're important because we've talked about and you have read about the various theories of power, whether we have a ruling class, pluralism versus elitism. And this week you're going to have some readings which actually attempt to measure and gauge the extent to which we have this kind of concentration of political power. And the studies that have been done by political scientists on this question are quite compelling. So you've got the classic piece, probably the most widely cited article on maybe the conclusion people have come to that the United States is no longer a democracy. That's the article by Gillens and Page. And it is connected to a book that Gillens wrote, and that Page has also recently written a book that highlights and elaborates further on the issue of concentration of power and how the concentration of power that we know at least exists in terms of the distribution of income and wealth translates into policy preferences. So you have the Gillens and Page article, and now you have yourself read this piece, which widely cited. And as you'll see, when you look at the other articles, they make reference to Gillens and Page's analysis. So you have that piece. You have a piece by Paul Starr, which provides a little bit of historical perspective on the idea of oligarchy and makes reference back to the Gilded Age, the period in American history when we had comparable levels of wealth and income inequality and concentration. And then you have a piece by McKay that links oligarchy and the concentration of power to the failure to address the most fundamental crisis facing humanity, and that is the climate crisis. And as the title suggests, it is not just a problem of science, it's a problem of politics. It's a problem of vested, concentrated interests, essentially preventing policies from being put in place that could save the planet or save humanity. In addition to those 3 required pieces, I have some other articles there you might want to look at. One is by Page and his colleagues, looking at the policy preferences of the wealthiest Americans, very similar to the analysis done with Gillens. Larry Bartles, is also a political scientist who has been studying these things as well. I'll make some reference to his work in my lecture. And I've always liked the work of Simon Johnson. Simon Johnson is a former IMF economist. You would not necessarily associate somebody who has worked for the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, as somebody who would engage in a kind of critical analysis of U.S. capitalism and political economy. But in fact, Simon Johnson has written several critical pieces. One that is very important, it was written some time ago. And you'll notice that many of these pieces are written or make reference to periods pre-Trump. So this is not something that's emerging because of the election of Donald Trump and Donald Trump's policies. Okay, this is a fundamental aspect of the American neoliberal political economic system, and this is what it's produced. If anything, things have gotten worse, but Trump didn't invent oligarchy. So do not confuse this as a partisan issue. It's a bipartisan contribution to the political economic system of neoliberalism and the consequences, which are, of course, the concentration of income, wealth, and political power. Simon Johnson's piece, The Quiet Coup. And that's a very interesting term to use, the quiet coup. We're hearing a lot of reference to this term coup now because we're coming into the November election. And there's concern that the outcome may be produced by the exercise of power. That is, by Donald Trump, who may in some way or another produce the level of chaos and confusion that allows him to remain in power despite the fact that he may not get a majority of the votes. Much more to say about that. There's a debate tonight between Trump and Biden. Maybe you'll check that out. I would say it could be a source of comic relief, but given the condition of America today, it could be a reflection of the larger tragedy of American democracy in action. In any case, in Simon Johnson's piece, The Quiet Coup, he talks about the financial oligarchy. And this is very important. I'll talk a little bit more about the financial sector next week and the financialization of the economy and how this has shaped some of the dynamics in American society. But if he is trying to identify, Simon Johnson, trying to identify the most powerful, potent source of political influence, he believes it resides in the financial sector as well. I have a link to the documentary Inside Job if you haven't seen it. It's probably one of the best ways to understand what produced the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. I have some other references there to Chicago, and that is because last semester I was talking to my students about the convention in Chicago in 1968, where there was mass uprising on the streets. Chicago police came out, this should sound familiar, and started beating up protesters. It was described as a police riot. Graham Nash wrote a song about that and the trial that followed. And there is now a film out on the Chicago 7, or sometimes called the Chicago 8, trial. I have a link to a YouTube version, which I think is actually better than this overly hyped Hollywood-style version of the Chicago 7, Chicago 8 trial. One thing I would just mention about that is that in my formative years as a teenager, there were several books I read that contributed to my radicalization. One of the events was the Chicago convention of the Democratic Party in 1968 and what happened there, and ultimately the trial that followed and the way the defendants were treated and what I learned about our society from that trial, the Chicago 7, or sometimes the Chicago 8, depending on whether you include Bobby Seale, the Black Panther, who was bound and gagged in the courtroom. So if you listen to the Graham Nash song, you will hear the lyrics. The first phrase is, though your brother's bound and gagged and they've chained him to a chair. Graham Nash, always politically conscious and aware, is making reference to the treatment of Bobby Seale during the Chicago 7 trial. Okay, I said this was going to be a short lecture, and I'm dragging it out with this introduction. So let me get started. And I hope you'll enjoy these readings, and I hope it will give you some insight on really what we're up against in the United States with regard to the concentration of political power. Now, before I do that, I want to share, as I often do, some very interesting kind of conceptual ideas that will help you make sense and maybe even engage in some effective political discussion, or what I like to say, political argument. There's nothing wrong with argument. Right? Lots of students say, well, we're going to discuss. We can argue. It's okay. All right? There's nothing wrong with conflict. There's nothing wrong with argument, as long as it's civil discourse. Albert Hirschman is somebody I had mentioned earlier in the semester. Exit, voice, and loyalty. He comes up with these fabulous analytical frameworks that help us make sense of different situations. And Albert O. Hirschman wrote a book called The Rhetoric of Reaction. Hirschman was a progressive, and he believed that it was important for governments, governmental institutions, to be putting in place policies that assisted and promoted progressive principles that largely, from his perspective, involved improving the quality of life of citizens. And he became quite frustrated because he saw that there was always this pushback from largely conservative forces that wanted to resist this progressive legislation or progressive programs or progressive policies that might have been proposed by people maybe left of the conservatives. So he put together this book, and he tried to describe the various rhetorical devices that conservatives use to try to stem and squelch progressive policy proposals. And he basically broke them into three categories, and I have them here. And I want you to think about these when you talk to people about different kinds of political issues. And you might be proposing some kind of policy, and they'll say, well, we can't do that because of this. We can't do that because of that. And they use these rhetorical devices. So what Hirschman was trying to do was to take the kinds of responses he was getting from people who oppose these progressive policies and putting them into categories. So he says there's sort of three theses that are used by conservatives to essentially stem the tide of moving legislation in a progressive direction. The first is what he calls the perversity thesis. And we can think of this in the context of a very important sociological principle. That's the law of unintended consequences. And the perversity thesis basically argues that social reform, even though, it might sound good, it might be a good idea, it ultimately is going to have perverse consequences. Consequences that in some sense totally undermine its original purpose. You understand? So the example I give, and I'm going to provide a little more elaboration on the minimum wage argument next week. But what many people will say is, well, the minimum wage, you're proposing the minimum wage to increase the amount of money that working class people will receive, but when you raise the minimum wage, it has this perverse effect of actually discouraging employment because the capitalists or the employers, right, will, because now that they're facing higher prices, cannot afford to hire as many workers. And so you have higher rates of unemployment as a result of raising the minimum wage, which perversely hurts the very workers you intended to benefit from raising the minimum wage. So that's the perversity thesis. Now, what I want to point out here is you can apply these theses to a variety of different policy areas. I'm just giving you one example. The other is the futility thesis. That is, any attempt at social improvement, social transformation, just isn't going to have any significant effect. You can try to do it, but it's going to be futile. It's going to be futile because there are some things that social legislation can simply not address. So one example I give, and again, this is just one example among many that you can apply the futility thesis toward, is yes, you can try to regulate guns, you can have gun control, but that is not going to have any effect. It's going to be totally futile because people, if they want to obtain guns, they can obtain them in an alternative way. So the policy, even though the intention is to reduce the circulation of guns, to control guns, to minimize violence, people will inevitably get access to weapons and it won't have any effect. It'll be entirely futile. The third is what is called, or at least what Hirschman called, the jeopardy thesis. And that is when you try to institute some progressive kind of policy, perhaps, what it might do is actually jeopardize some other positive thing that's happening in the society. So you often hear people say, well, if you're going to try to put in place all kinds of environmental regulations to address climate change, it's going to ultimately jeopardize the quality of life that has been produced by the economic growth that exists in, let's say, the United States. So you're jeopardizing the existing level of economic, material affluence, expansion, growth, trying to regulate the environment and trying to institute something to address the climate issue. So when you're talking with people and you're having discussions about policy, think about whether this is the kind of rhetoric, the kind of logic that people are using as they attempt to argue against any kind of progressive legislation. Cass Sunstein, who's a legal law professor, very influential, has written many policy books. He also provides a concept that is often used by conservatives. You've probably heard this term, the slippery slope. And sometimes people will say, well, once you go down that road, we're going, it's a slippery slope and we're going to go too far in one direction. So proposing, let's say, gun control legislation is the first step. You hear this all the time. Eventually, they're going to want to take all our guns away, right? So, any kind of movement toward gun control or gun regulation legislation is just the first step in a process that will inevitably result in the confiscation of guns by the American people. That's the slippery slope. And the slippery slope argument is applied widely. So I'm just providing these because we are in a political sociology class and I have students that are politically engaged, and you need to have an analytical framework in which to understand the arguments that people make on both sides. Okay, that's my ode to one of my favorite political economists, Albert Hirschman. Okay, so much of what you're reading this week involves the relationship between economic inequality, wealth inequality, income inequality, and how it translates into whether some groups have more political power, more political influence than others. So I mentioned, and there is a reading by Larry Bartels, and in his empirical analysis, he does a very, very detailed analysis of roll call voting by senators and the extent to which the way they vote is or is not in line and conforming with the preferences of particular constituents. Basically, he says, and I highlight this, in every instance, senators appear to be much more responsive to the opinions of affluent constituents than to the opinions of constituents with modest incomes. And he does the kind of analysis which you also will read about in the Gillens and Page classic piece. So you have some empirical analysis done by Bartels as well as Gillens and Page. Let me move my face over here. Okay. So one of the questions that Domhoff tells us we should be asking if we want to identify whether there is a kind of ruling class or a concentration of power. Among the three questions, one is who wins, right? And that's essentially what Gillens and Page are trying to do here. And in a very sort of standard social science research journal article formulaic approach, they basically say, look, there's a series of theories about how policy is ultimately determined and arrived at, public policy, right? And you have these four different theoretical models. Majoritarian electoral, that is, that the policies that are put in place largely reflect the preferences of the majority of people in the country, majority of people who are participating. You have economic elite domination. This falls more in line with the kind of Domhoffian approach. You have majoritarian pluralism, which is a kind of pluralism that Robert Dahl is associated with, where you have a wide range of organizations and groups, interest groups across the entire population, and some win. Sometimes some get their preferences, sometimes they lose. But the point is that everyone has the opportunity to organize and to pressure through these organizational vehicles, public officials, government, to impact policy. And then you have biased pluralism. And for Gillens and Page, what this means is, yes, there are organizations which impact policy. There are lobbying groups, and there are interest groups that have preferences about what kind of policies they want to see put in place. And his point is that there are particular organizations and particular interest groups that have enormous amounts of power and obviously dominate. And so the pluralism, yes, there are pressure groups, interest groups, but the point is that some are much more powerful. They have more financial resources. They represent the interests of the capitalist class, and they are the ones that win consistently, while other organizations do not have the resources, do not have the power, do not have the funding, and they have no chance, right? So there could be some aspects in the American polity of pluralism, but it's highly, highly concentrated among a series of very powerful organizations, usually organizations that represent corporate interests, as we well know. Okay, so they try to essentially, and this is based on massive amounts of data. There's the book by Gillens is called Affluence and Influence, and you can find many of his other articles. So he has something which I don't have, and that is a large cadre of graduate students to go out and study every single policy and link all of these policies to various surveys that have been done on people's attitudes and preferences and opinions about these policies, and to look at whether some people's opinions carry more weight than others, or whether majority opinion dominates, right? So majoritarian versus bias versus domination, all right? Okay, so it's a very, very elaborate, detailed, rigorous, empirical analysis, something that goes far beyond what Domhoff has been able to do, but Domhoff informs the analysis they do, because the economic elite domination theory is one that the researchers, Gillens, Page, et al., because there's a whole group involved in this project, were trying to address. So I say Gillens and a small army of research assistants. That's actually a quote from his book. And there's a variety of charts, and I pulled out just a few here. But the main point is this. If you look at, for example, the 50th percentile, the bottom 50% of the American population, and you look to see whether there's any relationship among that lower strata of American society, whether there's any relationship between the degree to which the percent of that segment of the population agrees with a particular policy, to what extent does that increasing percentage of the majority of Americans in support of a policy mean in terms of policies actually put in place? That is, do the opinions of the average American matter? Are they in any way translated into policies that reflect the preferences of the majority of Americans? And what you see in the top chart, okay, is essentially a flat line. In other words, it doesn't matter how popular a particular policy is and whether there is growing support in a vast majority of people in favor of that policy. You can see that the likelihood, the odds of, the probability of that policy being put in place, flat. Doesn't seem to make any difference, right? Then we look at the preferences of the wealthiest, the economic elites, as they describe them. And as you see, as the percentage of that segment of the population increases in endorsing a particular policy, how likely is it that that policy will be put in place? And you see this steep line, okay? All right, so here is essentially what we'll say the bottom line, the conclusion. The central point that emerges from our research is that economic elites and organized groups, economic elite domination, organized groups, bias, pluralism, representing business interests have substantial independent impacts on U.S. government policy, while mass-based interest groups and average citizens have little or no influence. Now, later in their article, as you'll see, they basically come to the conclusion that given the results of this research, it is difficult to sustain an argument that the American political system operates in any way that resembles, that reflects democratic representation. Okay? So that's the main point of their research, or at least the main conclusion. So the oligarchy rules. This is a bumper sticker. Excuse me, I'm going through my morning congestion. This is a bumper sticker I had in my car back maybe 5 or 6 years ago. I don't know if you remember, but in 2015, there were these bumper stickers that read, "I'm ready for Hillary." People were getting all, juiced up for the 2016 election, and these bumper stickers came out from the Democratic Party associated with Hillary Clinton. "I'm ready for Hillary." And I decided I would put something more realistic on my automobile. I don't like all that partisan stuff. "I'm ready for oligarchy. The choice is clear. There is none." So this is a classic bumper sticker and a classic phrase that I hope you can appreciate. But the point is that despite what happens in the election in November, we are still faced with a political economic system, American-style capitalism, neoliberal political economic regime that has produced probably one of the strongest, most powerful concentration of political power in the form of an oligarchy in our history. And that's not going to go away when Trump is removed from office. So these are issues that will remain. And as long as we have this system in place, it's likely that we will see further forms of extreme political behavior. Since we're talking about oligarchy, let me just move this little, there we go. Since we're talking about oligarchy, it has been in the news recently. The term is something that is not usually associated with the American political system. People will say, we live in a democracy. Oligarchy is something that exists, under feudalism, or, maybe in third world countries, but the United States is not. Well, it is an oligarchy. Given what we know about the distribution of wealth and income and how that translates into power, we do live in an oligarchy today. And it's important not to be complacent about the severity of the political economic concentration that exists. Now, you may have heard that over the course of the COVID-19 crisis that many people are suffering from economically, on the one hand, you also have a small group of very wealthy billionaires who have expanded their riches in a dramatic fashion over this period. By the way, this chart does not give us the full extent of the increase in the amount of wealth that is now in the hands of this, what they call the oligarchic dozen, these 12 individuals, because this only goes through March 18th. And we have additional months since then where the wealth has further increased in the hands of each one of these individuals. In fact, just the other day, it was announced that Jeff Bezos had exceeded $200 billion. So you can see this chart is a little behind the times. But the point is that during this most severe economic crisis the United States has faced since the Great Depression, obviously the distribution of pain is not equally felt, and there are individuals that are profiting greatly from this crisis. I often say that people like to think of capitalism as something of an advance over feudalism. I would say that feudalism couldn't match the concentration of wealth that currently exists in the United States. There's simply no comparable historical comparison to what has been taking place and what has gotten worse in this crisis. I also want to say something about what I call degenerate capitalism, the U.S. Capitalist system. And the point I want to make is something that has existed for a while, but it has reached such an extreme level that it is worthy of mentioning again and emphasizing again. And that is the distinction between the larger real economy, where people work, labor, things are produced, there are businesses that are engaged in economic activity. That's the real economy. We know that this has taken a huge nosedive during the COVID-19 crisis. We've had the largest decline in gross domestic product ever reported, and that includes compared to the Great Depression. And of course, this has produced massive amount of pain, unemployment, economic insecurity. We haven't even seen the beginning of what's going to happen when all of the eviction moratoriums are removed. So you're going to have greater levels of homelessness, hunger. There was no relief package coming. This just makes reference to the food banks that have been essentially, eliminated in terms of the resources they have, because there are so many people who are desperate for aid and assistance, and they can't keep up with the demand. And you've got these long lines of people waiting to gain access to any kinds of resources they can at these food banks across the country. So you have food lines, unemployment, etc. So on the one hand, you have this aspect of the current American economic situation. And on the other hand, You might have heard, might have read that Wall Street set an all-time record a couple months ago. So on the one hand, the greatest drop in gross domestic product in American history, influencing and impacting millions, tens of millions of workers. And on the other hand, you have the financial sector, Wall Street, setting an all-time record. So the disconnect between what is taking place in the financial sector and what is taking place with the rest of the economy has never been as great. And when people think about capitalism as a system theoretically, they assume that there's some relationship, some connection between finance and the larger health of the economy. We now have a form of capitalism, I call it degenerate capitalism, deformed capitalism, late neoliberalism, if you like, that has produced an economic arrangement that defies any kind of rational basis in terms of how finance, access to capital resources, which is what finance is supposed to provide, and the health of the rest of the economy. And notice here it says traders are looking ahead to further stimulus. Well, what you need to understand is that much of the government response to this crisis has been designed to explicitly prop up and ensure the health of, first and foremost, the financial sector, the banks, and the dollar, which is what allows the United States to be as globally dominant as it is. The strength of the dollar, the strength of the currency. So the stimulus, which we try to think of as distributing income to people in a time of need, to support economic security, to ensure that people aren't starving, to ensure that people can pay their rent. The stimulus disproportionately impacts, and the actions of the Federal Reserve, in terms of money supply, is being utilized to prop up, to benefit, to enrich a very, very, very small segment of the American population. And the fact that in the midst of a political campaign for president, we have two political parties say nothing about this. I don't expect Trump and his cronies to say anything about this. I would expect the Democrats maybe to discuss this issue, since it impacts millions and millions and millions of Americans. It might actually galvanize and mobilize them. You might ask, why wouldn't they do this? If it's going to mobilize people to support the Democratic Party and to maybe vote for Biden so he can win the election. But you have to remember, there's two issues here. One is practical politics, mobilizing people. The other is a political party that is dominated by the financial interests. And the Democratic Party is as tightly connected, if not more tightly connected, to Wall Street, to the financial sector, than the Republicans. And so there may be a reason why the Democrats don't bring up this issue. It's because it conflicts with the interests of their leading donor constituency, that is the financial sector. So this is where we are. And you see these headlines, and this is one way I try to illustrate many of these points, is just to show people what is being reported on a daily basis. Now, of course, most of these reports don't get into the heart of the analysis in terms of fundamental aspects of capitalism. They try not to go that far because they don't want to necessarily call into question the sanctity of the capitalist market system in the United States. They don't want to put those ideas in people's heads. But it has become so egregiously extreme that even mainstream business publications like The Economist, The Market versus the Real Economy, a dangerous gap. Financial markets have got out of whack with the economy. Something has to give. Something has to give. What is it? Right? These are symptoms of a bigger fundamental political economic problem. They often don't want to go to that fundamental political economic problem because it would call into question the entire political economic arrangement of American capitalism. Wall Street feasts on federal coronavirus aid, point I just made before, while Main Street starves. You can do a little reading to see how all of this massive amount of money, at least in the first relief bill, CARE Act, was distributed. Who benefited the most? Did it actually get to the businesses that it needed to get to? And what we see is that small businesses receive very, very little. And you've got millions and millions and millions and millions, I don't know, tens of millions of people who work in these small businesses. These businesses are not going to come back. They're going bankrupt. They will disappear. And so will the jobs that are associated with them. And right now, in the midst of this crisis, neither political party has stepped up to indicate exactly how serious it is, how distorted the economy is, and how we need a fundamental restructuring of the political economic system. Because we've got two parties that are both closely tied to corporate interests. All right, so that's my reference to degenerate capitalism, as some people call it. That certainly is an apt way to describe American capitalism today. On that note, I will say goodbye and enjoy the reading, and I hope that you will learn some things about the nature of our political system further. And I hope that you'll appreciate some of the empirical analyses that have been done by these political scientists, both Bartels and in particular, Gillens and Page. Until next week, adios.